All right, thanks everyone for being here again. My name is Holly Meyer and I am the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Sioux Falls. Very excited to see you all today, so thank you for joining us. I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, our first keynote speaker of the day. But before that, just one housekeeping item. So after the keynote, we have our break for lunch. That officially starts at 11:30, and lunch is on your own. So feel free to head out, grab something, and then we start up again at 1 p.m. Breakout sessions start right at 1. So if you can be here a little bit before, that's really great. Then we can make sure to start on time and end on time. And you can go right to the breakout rooms. We won't need to come to this main ballroom before then. So just head right to the breakout session of your choice at 1 p.m. All right. So our first keynote today is Laura Edwards. Laura Edwards was appointed as the SDSU Extension State Climatologist in January 2017. She is based at the Aberdeen Regional Extension Center. Previous to her appointment as state climatologist, she had been the SDSU Extension Climate Field Specialist from 2011 to 2017. Her previous experience includes 8 years as a research climatologist at the Western Regional Climate Center in Reno, Nevada, and 2 years as the assistant state climatologist in Maryland. She holds a master's degree in meteorology from the University of Maryland and a bachelor's degree in physics and French from the University of Minnesota. She currently lives in the country outside of Aberdeen, South Dakota, with her family. Please join me in welcoming Laura Edwards.
All right, thank you, Holly, for that introduction and for the invitation to visit with you today. And she basically said everything you need to know about me. Here's a picture that I'd like to share with you. I don't know what you see there, but I see a river that's about to flood. That was actually the James River, not the Big Sioux, in 2019, courtesy of Delta Airlines flying over the river out of Aberdeen. And I think water, rivers, and precipitation are one of the largest challenges that we have in addressing the changing climate here in South Dakota. Of course, we see changes in temperature as well, which I'll go into here in a little bit. But precipitation, I think, is one of our biggest challenges in managing water, either too much or too little, or maybe both at the same time. I'll start off talking about temperature trends, and Holly had asked me to talk about the trends and data that we see here in South Dakota and in the local area here. And so I have quite a few charts and numbers to share, but I know there's a number of engineers in the room, so hopefully you can appreciate some of the data that I'll share with you today. First of all, looking at South Dakota more broadly, so the whole state looking at average temperature. You see the average line in the black solid line, that's the 1901 to 2000 average temperature. The blue line is indicating the trend over that time period. With this, you can see obviously increases in temperature as a trend over the 128 years of records. This is 1895 to 2021. The data here from NOAA, from National Center for Environmental Information, and showing a 2-degree Fahrenheit temperature increase over that time period, over a 100-year period, I should say, is the trend. So keeping that in mind, let's take a look at Minnehaha County, right here where we are here today. Our average temperature here is also increasing at the same rate as the statewide average, about 2 degrees per century. And when we're looking at climate change projections, a lot of it is looking at 100 years in the future as well. So when we look at the past data, 2 degrees per century historically already is what we're seeing. So we're already experiencing quite a bit of increase in temperature. And when you look at that black line, the average, you look at the more recent years or last couple decades, we're not seeing as many of those cold temperatures as we have in the past. In fact, some of our minimum temperatures for this county have been, especially in the late 1990s, early 2000s, even the cooler years in that period were warmer than what we've seen in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. You also note, though, too, that there are a lot of fluctuations in temperature. So when we're talking about a changing climate, it's not like a step change necessarily, but it's a gradual change over time. And when I talk about temperature and warming temperatures, I kind of liken it to, I've heard an analogy about walking a dog, where you're going in this general direction, but the dog is walking all over the place, left and right, or up and down around your general direction. And so that's kind of how I describe a temperature change here. It's not like just a step up and then all of a sudden you're there. What's really interesting, though, when we look at temperature changes in this part of the country, in South Dakota, and this is true for Minnehaha County here too, if we separate the maximum temperature and the minimum temperature, we see different trend lines there. And this is looking at annual temperature, so it doesn't separate by seasons in this case. So we don't see really too much of an increase in maximum temperatures, a little bit, but just a little, almost like less than 1 degree, right? Less than 1 degree per century. But you do see, again, that big swings as similar as we see the average temperature. What's really interesting are the minimum temperatures, and we're seeing warmer overnight temperatures. This has a lot of potential impacts that I'll talk about a little bit later, both in human health. There's a presentation earlier about animal agriculture, animal health, and demands on cooling systems in the summer, and those kinds of things, changing the demand of energy for heating and cooling, and a lot of impacts are already being seen, I think, with this increase in minimum temperature. Cropping systems, agriculture, production. What's driving this? Generally, increase in humidity, which relates to our increase in temperature, or in precipitation rather, that I'll talk about a little bit later. What's driving the increase in humidity? Well, there's a lot of things there that I'll talk about a little bit later. That could be related to increase in precipitation, increases in soil moisture, changing in agriculture systems, going from fallow to corn-soybean rotation in the last couple decades especially, changing in the landscape. So a lot of things can affect the humidity, but we see the increase in minimum temperature over that time. That's driving basically our average temperature. Just looking at average temperature here, separated by seasons, what I've shown you so far have been annual trends. And again, this is all 1895 to 2021, separating by the different seasons. And what are the temperature trends per century, looking at the 4 different seasons. Wintertime is warming faster than any other season, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit per 100 years. Coming in second is spring, and then summer. But we see increases in all 4 seasons. And again, that can affect a lot of different systems, from energy to agriculture production, and use of water, and a lot of other things there that I know that you all are thinking about already in the Big Sioux watershed and Sioux Falls area. But we're not unusual. This is information from the last National Climate Assessment, the 4th National Climate Assessment, and the data science report that went into that in 2017 to 2018. So a common around the Northern Plains area are temperatures warming on the annual trend. No big surprise there. And similar here, we see increases faster in winter season than the summer season. Sioux Falls, the southern South Dakota area, is kind of right on the fringe where we see actually some cooling in summer as we get further south of here. But we have seen some warming trends here in South Dakota. So looking ahead at projected changes. So what I've shown you so far is what we've already measured over the last 127, 128 years or so. What do we see going forward? And this is actually from that same National Climate Assessment report that was published in 2018. They're currently revising, updating, and writing the next climate assessment, the 5th one that will be published late next year. And I'll give some information about that later, how you can participate in that process. Projected changes in annual average temperature, and this is separated by mid-21st century and late 21st century. So mid-21st century is the top, that's about 2035 to 2065. The late 21st century is looking at 2070 to 2099. So how do they come up with these? They look at greenhouse gas emissions. It's been tied very closely, scientifically proven that that's a significant driver in global temperature. And so they look at different scenarios of global greenhouse gas emissions to determine the model output here. So you see a lower scenario on the left and the higher scenario on the right. No matter which way you slice it or dice it here, really the message is that our temperatures are going to be warming all across the board through the rest of the century. It's just a matter of how much. Just taking a little bit of a closer look at some of the emission data that they're using. So there's 2 different methods, the SRES, which was started being used in 2000, and then the RCP scenarios, which started in about 2010 or so, more common in global climate modeling. And they have this separated here by different greenhouse gases, but almost all of them that we look at will see some increases. And this is looking again at global emissions. So they're looking at development across multiple countries, cooperation and policy and international agreements, all of those kinds of things to help determine what are the emission pathways, emission futures of the globe. And then at the last, on the bottom right graphics there, you look at global temperature expected under those emission scenarios. Again, looking at the higher to lower emission scenarios, you see essentially at least a little bit of warming to maybe a lot of warming across the globe. So why, I get this question a lot, why do we tie greenhouse gas emissions and use that as a core modeling piece, or one of the essential modeling pieces in global temperature projections? And that's because of graphs like this. So the graph on the left is looking at a lot of different model outputs. You see those squiggly lines from looking at 1880 to 2020 and how accurate they are in recreating the climate. That's their test of how good they are, and then which ones get used in the future to project temperature changes and so on. And you see the orange kind of shaded area, that's kind of the range that you see in that model output in trying to recreate past climate. On the right there, that thick line is what would the climate be if we only had natural forcing, no greenhouse gas considerations. You cannot recreate our current climate without including greenhouse gas emissions. You just don't get warm enough. And that blue line, or that blue shaded area around that dark line, is just the natural forcing part of the equation. So that's why models are useful. And I'd say, we started, when I was in graduate school looking at climate model projections, things that were developed in the 90s have turned out to be pretty close to right on. So I have increasing faith and confidence in the global climate projections that they know what they're talking about. Some other side things here, looking at just temperatures, plant hardiness zones. I know that this is something that a lot of gardeners think about. It might be on the back of their seed packet, like what zone or what shrub or tree can you grow, those kinds of things, but it affects a lot of other things too. It's basically a metric of how cold we get in the winter. What is our extreme coldest temperature in the winter, and what can survive those coldest temperatures in the winter season? This was what you might know as the sunset plant hardiness zones from 1990. They were updated in 2012, so this is already about a decade old, but about the most recent information we have, showing essentially, I don't have a quick way to show it, but essentially a northward progression of climate, of plant hardiness zones over this time. So now when we look at South Dakota, a lot of this area here is in that 4B range or so, 4A to 4B, and areas are moving northward, as maybe you've noticed that we can grow different landscaping plants, different horticultural things outside with this warmer winter trend that we have in this part of the country. Looking out in the future, again, building off of temperature data from global and regional climate models, a couple researchers looked at what's the future of plant hardiness zones, and this could have implications in how you decide to landscape, and if you're looking at sustainability plans and maybe greening up the city and the communities. We see an average shift of climate zones from around the turn of the century, 1971 to 2000, that 30-year period, compared to the mid to late part of this century, 2040 to 2070. They see average shift of climate zones about 93 kilometers, so about 57 miles northward. And the most rapid movement of those zones are in this part of the country, in the Northern Plains region, where they see the most rapid movement of those climate zones, or those hardiness zones. So not to say you can start going out there right now and start planting, all these shrubs and trees and flowers that you see in southern zones, but that when you're thinking out decades of time, that like you're in the urban forest and that kind of thing, there's potential to grow some different things. And also, there's some negative implications too, with potential overwintering of some insects, plant diseases, those kinds of things that won't freeze in that future climate. So there's ups and downs to both sides of that story. Another kind of secondary thing that we see with temperature is a longer growing season. And this is kind of a finicky thing with frost dates. We're basically looking at when is our last spring frost and when's our first fall frost. So we define that as the growing season. How many days is that, for example? And so on the left is the historical, already observed increase in our frost-free season, or our growing season between frosts. And we've already seen an increase of about 11 days around this part of the country. And that's what I've seen in South Dakota, about 10 to 12 days. But it's really variable, especially when we have drought years with low humidity, and you can see a very late season frost, say like Memorial Day or later. We see just a fluke day that gets really cold, for example. Similar in the fall, you could have a early frost, in September that is weeks early and then get warm again. So frost-free season is kind of a funny thing because you could have that one day on either side that kind of skews it. Looking though at projected changes in the frost-free season, again, piggybacking off of increases in temperature all across the seasons, we see an increase in frost-free season length, or that growing season length, projected into the mid to late part of the century as well. So that's looking at 20 to 30 years, not too far away. And around this area, about 10 days or more of a frost-free season. So, we're seeing agricultural folks, row crop production increase. They're able to plant earlier, assuming they can get in the fields, and have a longer season hybrid, for example, and with a potential for higher yield in corn and soybeans, or whatever that might be. So there's some potential here for increasing food production as well, in addition to just hobbyists with gardens in yards. So looking at precipitation trends, we've seen a lot of flooding lately, right? A lot of flooding. And as I kind of alluded earlier, I think this is one of those areas where the rubber hits the road for South Dakota climate. So this is looking at statewide, so similar to what I showed for temperature, statewide precipitation is increasing at a rate of about 1.8 inches per century. So almost 2 inches more of rain. So that can be a lot depending where you are. Down in the southeastern corner, annual average precipitation is 24, 26 inches. Up in the northwest part of the state, it's only 17 inches a year. So that could be a lot of moisture depending where you're at. And you might notice that big spike up in 2019, heads and shoulders above any other year, the wettest year on record statewide. There are very few parts of the state where that was not the wettest year, and mostly like in the Black Hills, southwest part of the state. Almost everywhere else in the state, 2019 is the wettest year of record, and you guys all survived that. So, looking closer here at Minnehaha County, again, this is annual total precipitation. This includes rain and snowfall equivalent, 1895 to 2021. What's really unique here is that 3 of the top 5 wettest years have occurred since 2010. 3 of the top 5 wettest years in 127 years of record. And 2019, of course, is number 1. 2018 was number 2. So that was a compounded factor there when 2019 was the wettest year for a lot of people, but 2018 for this part of the state was the second wettest year behind that. And then 2010 ranked 4th out of the top 5, and they hold spots. The remaining in the top 10 were older previous to that. But you see, again, a lot of variability there. We can still see drought and floods both in this region. I think that's one of the challenges in managing water resources are the big fluctuations and extremes. So keep in mind 2019, 2018. When you look at the rank here, this is the top 10 wettest years in Minnehaha County. You see those 1 and 2, 2019, 2018, and then a number of other years following there, more in the mid-1900s and so on. What's interesting, though, is the top 10 driest years. We don't see very many of those in the last couple decades. Don't see very many of those, but ranked, trying to see, 1, 2, 3. The 6th one, 2020. So thinking back, we had 2018 was wettest year until 2019 was the wettest year. 2020 then ranked in the driest, number 6 driest year. So I think that's one of the stories here when we're talking about climate change is that we have seen, and I think we'll expect to see in the future, very large swings, wet to dry and back and forth. Another example of this is 2011 to 2012, where we had 2011 extreme flooding on the Missouri River. By 2012, we had exceptional drought down in this part of the country, all across the Corn Belt, once or twice in a century kind of drought. So we see these large swings from year to year, or a couple years at a time, going back and forth. Precipitation here, increasing generally on the annual basis, as I shared here in Minnehaha County, but it's not even across all the seasons. So similar to temperature, we don't see even changes throughout all the seasons. We see more precipitation increases in the spring and fall. Overall, though, about 1.8 at 175, 1.8, almost 2 inches of rain annually is an increasing trend. See a small reduction in summertime precipitation, though. And again, just like temperature, this is not unusual. We're not unique here in this way. A lot of people in our same region are looking at the same trends historically, with annual precipitation increasing in general, and spring and fall is where we see more of our precipitation increases coming from, not so much the winter and summer in this part of the country. What's interesting, though, and slightly unique, maybe not so much in Minnehaha County, but we see more in the central part of the state. And this is the data from 2017 to 2018 that's being updated here as we speak. But we see South Dakota increasing at one of the fastest rates of the country as far as total precipitation goes, about 15%. And again, that amounts to, 2 to 4 inches, 2 to 3 inches annual precipitation, depending where you're at. So we're seeing some very steep trends in precipitation. And part of this is it's a feedback loop. When you have increase in temperature, and this is looking globally, increase in temperature, more humidity, more evaporation, more water vapor in the atmosphere. But that water vapor does not fall as precipitation on the same as on everyone. So we're in a place of the country that's seeing increases in precipitation, where you look at like the Southwest, for example, they're becoming more arid. So it's that increase in precipitation is not happening the same everywhere. Another thing is not just extreme years in precipitation, wet and dry, but extreme single events. We're seeing increases in the number of days that we see heavy precipitation. And so we look at on the left 4 panels there, that's the observed change, the historical change that we've already seen in our single day, 20-year return frequency precipitation events. And that's looking at the actual amount of precipitation that we see coming from those events. So we see an increase in our rainfall, our total rainfall, coming from those extreme heavy one-day events. On the right, you see the projected change in those single-day, 20-year return precipitation events. And you look across the board there, and you see, again, the lower emissions are at the top. This is on the right 4. The lower emissions at the top, that's the greenhouse gas emissions. Higher emissions at the bottom 2, and then you see the mid-century and late century, different breakdowns there. So again, no matter which way you slice or dice it, no matter which way you cut it, we're going to see increases in precipitation coming from heavy rain events, or precipitation events. Shouldn't just say rain, could be snow. And so we've seen this a lot across South Dakota recently, where we've seen our state 24-hour record for precipitation get challenged a number of times. And what often comes down to is just a documentation or a rain gauge that hasn't been calibrated. So we can't prove it for sure, but we know we've seen some extreme rainfalls of 11, 14 inches, amounts like that, and due to thunderstorm activity most often. And of course we've seen flooding, flash flooding come along with that. Also, what's funny, or maybe not funny, along with that is that we have increasing precipitation, more of it coming from heavy events, but we're also seeing drought at the same time. And so when you look at a distribution of rain events, and more of your rain coming in big events, you have that opportunity for short-term or flash drought to develop in between those times. And then you look at also annual cycles, or where we've seen these fluctuations from year to year or a couple years at a time. We also see the opportunity for drought to develop in those dry years in between. So when you look at, I'm showing some data here from the U.S. Drought Monitor, which only has been in publication since 2000. But looking at the Big Sioux River watershed over that time period, you see a lot of, I'd say, moderate level drought over the years, especially in the early 2000s. You see a lot of ups and downs there in the amount, and this is a weekly map, so you see a lot of ups and downs because of the weekly data that's shown here. A lot of fluctuations there, flirting with moderate drought. And then 2012, of course, was one of the most severe droughts we've seen here in this region. But in this part of the state, we really don't see drought that much as compared to central or western part of the state. When I look at statewide numbers of drought, you guys have been more fortunate in experiencing less drought generally and less severe drought than many other parts of the state. But no question, 2012 is probably the drought of memory for a lot of us, but just the last couple years have really challenged that, depending where you are in the watershed here. And that's what you see on the far right there, with drought essentially since mid-2020, more or less. We were living off of water from 2019 for quite a while. In the river, I think for general water supply, but also on the agriculture side, we were able to store a lot of that in soil moisture and utilize that for a 2020 crop, maybe even to 2021. But then we started to see more severe impacts with water availability and impacts in general. When we look at future climate, this is kind of the story. This is looking at soil moisture, which isn't exactly drought, but it's one metric by which we can define drought. Looking at projected changes in soil moisture, looking at end of century, so it's 2070 to 2099, looking at a higher emissions scenario, so think about that, that means more warming. So this is a little more on the extreme warmer side, but breaking that down by the 4 different seasons. The stippling or the red dots areas are changes that are large compared to our natural variation. The hashed areas with the slanted lines indicates that change is likely to be small compared to the natural variations that we've seen. And then you see the colors underlying that, with the browns getting drier and the greens getting wetter. I think here the story is generally the summer where we see more of that larger fluctuation, more drying compared to what we've seen historically. And I think that is maybe a season where we see more impact, especially on the agriculture side. I know that's true, where that's a prime season, of course, with our rain-fed systems. We don't have a lot of irrigation here in South Dakota, so that has some potential impact on agriculture production. But I know a lot of farmers are working hard to build, their management or create management systems that can improve how much water they keep on the landscape. And we heard one producer this morning talk about what they're doing with cover crops and reducing tillage and those kinds of things to keep as much water and carbon they can on the landscape to avoid those really severe drought years that we might see and that we have seen and may continue to see. And so this changes in soil moisture is kind of reflecting that really extreme precipitation pattern that we're seeing with dry periods in between larger events, in part. So looking at some other impacts and some other questions that I get sometimes about not just temperature or precipitation, but what else do we see? Well, just in recapping a little bit of the impact side, and I work a lot with agricultural audiences, so some of this is slanted that way, but looking at warmer temperatures and warmer extreme minimum temperatures, higher potential, as I said, for overwintering of insect pests, some diseases. That longer frost-free season that I mentioned too also offers opportunity for multiple generations. So especially I noticed the last few years when we've had a very late frost in the fall, we've had an extra time for weeds to come up, another flush of weeds in the fall, for example. And that can affect urban and rural landscapes both. Those dandelions are a little harder to kill when we don't have a frost, for example. More precipitation potentially following as rain instead of snow. Snow and snowpack is kind of a natural reservoir, right? So when we hold that water as snow, we keep it longer until we need it, generally in the spring and summer season. And so when we see warmer winter temperatures and or a longer frost-free season, that shortens our snow window a little bit. I mean, we're not going to get so warm that we're not going to have snow, but we're going to see more precipitation, falls, rain, as snow. So that has implications for runoff and potentially not having that water available later on the landscape. And potential for flash flooding as well, as I know we've seen a number of events in the Sioux Falls area with that recently. And then changing in heating and cooling needs. Again, with those warmer temperatures, particularly in the summer, in the overnight times, increased need for energy, for cooling, for air conditioning. This is a human health thing. But we also see this on the livestock side, on the animal agriculture side, animal health and suffering with extreme heat. Maybe might change the wintertime, and we might not need as much energy for heating in the overnight, but we're still, again, cold in our climate, so we're not going to lose all that need for heating in general. Wetter and warmer conditions may allow more favorable environment for some plant disease and so on, and increasing growth rates of vegetation. So this is actually an opportunity when we're thinking of, I don't know if you guys have talked about, but I know one of my colleagues, John McMain, talks about green infrastructure, and this is a great opportunity to create some of those urban environments with taking advantage of the warmer and wetter conditions. Increasing in heavy rain rates also increases the risk of flash flooding. So not just more precipitation in general, but increasing flash flooding with the short-term drought, as I mentioned. And when I talked with some foresters in the Black Hills not too long ago, and they're really thinking about changing forest dynamics and their snow catch and that kind of thing. But I think the same is true in the urban environment too, where you can alter, your runoff regimes, snow catch in the winter, and by looking at your urban forestry. And then one other thing that's maybe not too relevant to the city per se, but the surrounding area is changing in wildfire regimes. Our state wildland fire meteorologist, Dr. Darren Clabo out in Rapid City, he talks about this a lot. One of the artifacts of a changing climate is essentially a 12-month fire season. And it's not just in the shoulder seasons where we have dry vegetation and we get a high wind, hot day, something like that, but we've seen some of our largest fires recently in December 2017, I believe, the Legion Lake fire in the Black Hills, one of the largest wildfires in the tree area, in the forested area. So we can see fire all year round. Looking at large impact as far as economic disasters go, or natural disasters, we've already seen, I think, our fair share this year, starting with the derecho in May, right, May 12th, and then another one just a few weeks later in June that affected this part of the country. And so this is just looking at the billion with the B, $billion disasters in the current year so far in 2022. Obviously, hurricanes show up. They show up, any hurricane significance always shows up, but we've seen a number here, right here, not too far from us, mostly related to the derecho, couple derecho events or storm systems that came through in the spring. But when we look at South Dakota trends in these billion-dollar disasters, you can say that a warmer, wetter climate could be contributing to trends in these high impact events. And so the bar colors indicate which kind of disaster it was, whether it be drought or flood, which are the most common we see here, severe storms. Freeze, widespread freezes can also cause enough damage to qualify for a billion-dollar disaster. And then the squiggly line underneath is the actual dollars, and that's on the right-hand vertical axis and the cost of each of those events. So the largest one that we see here is 2012 drought. That's the highest dollar impact as far as South Dakota goes in natural disasters since they've been keeping track here on this graph. But we see an increase in the number of events. 2019 flood, 2019 flood and then 2012 drought are the top two. But we see an increase in frequency. We used to see 0 to 1 events, now we see more like 1 to 2 events per year. Another thing I get asked a lot too is severe weather. Are we going to see a lot more severe weather? Here in Sioux Falls, you've had tornadoes in December, not too long ago, tornado in September 11th, 2019. So are we going to see more severe weather? That's a little less certain. But nationally, when we look at national trends, we see really tornadoes focusing more on big events, like multiple tornadoes in a single day with a big system, big multiple tornado system going through. So that could translate to fewer days of severe weather, but those days could be higher impact with more tornadoes. And this is looking at nationally speaking. Up here, we're at kind of the north end of the tornado range, and so our data, our trends aren't as clear if we're going to see more or less summer severe weather. So just touching on a couple other things, I know we have experts touching on a lot of these topics in more depth, but no question, I think a couple of presenters this afternoon on the second keynote will talk about water with our increasing population, and it's great to see the amount of growth that we've seen in this area, but certainly along with that comes increase in water demand. But I think my concern here is the large fluctuations within short periods of time and managing that water system for delivery. I heard earlier on one of the panels about energy delivery, seeing fluctuations. They see fluctuations in hours, hours, days. But we see fluctuations that are hard to overcome too in that seasonal to annual range as well. Flooding and flash flooding, we've seen a number of high impact flash flooding events here in the Sioux Falls area in the last decade or two since I've been here. And certainly that's an important factor to consider when you're building right along a river here like we are in new development. Some data that I've found, that I've seen is the state gets money through FEMA when they have a natural disaster, and they use a portion of that money to mitigate future disasters. And part of what they've done is some land acquisitions, or homes, mostly acquisitions or relocations. And through that program, they've funded 4 homes acquired through that program in Sioux Falls since 2011, and I think those were really just a couple years ago. And those are homes that were in the floodplain, flooded out, and from what I understand, those homes acquired then cannot be rebuilt in that same place. They're not just here though, but I looked throughout the data that I had since 2011, looking at the Big Sioux River watershed. There are 26 others, homes and buildings that were acquired through that program, and mostly in the Del Rapids or Madison area. And I know there's the lake effect there in the Madison area, but this is something that I don't know that we want to be spending a lot of money on when we could be mitigating disasters other ways if we didn't have to worry about so much home relocation and home acquisitions. And so thinking of smart planning in the floodplain, how can we avoid costly measures like home acquisitions and relocations? Some of them have been there quite a while, but not all of them. And then managing irrigation. I mean, irrigation in the urban environment, not just the rural environment. And again, I think flooding is one of the biggest deals there. Energy, and I've kind of alluded this too, this is mostly a temperature thing, but it could be temperature and humidity, where you have like a feels like temperature, right? Or a heat index or a wind chill factor that is how we experience temperature. But certainly we've talked about the human health concern there. Variable temperature extremes, so that could relate to energy demand. When we have especially dry air and we see more drought, we see larger temperature swings day to night, 35, 40 degrees day to night. That can change our energy demand on the daily basis, but also looking at just increasing temperatures in general, and are we building the right infrastructure, homes, businesses, and so on. I know I used to work in my previous position in Reno. I worked in a brand new LEED certified building, and we had all this passive solar, which is fantastic for warming. And then they had these power curtains that would go up and down to try to cool us down. And some of the technology maybe got in the way of the comfort of the people, but there are ways to really make a very pleasant office or home experience, workplace, and use natural energy to your advantage. Increasing in number of electric or hybrid cars, whether or not that's something you want to adopt, I know that's something that other people around the region are thinking about. And can we build the infrastructure to support, recharging those vehicles? I know personally we were looking at buying a new vehicle a year ago this time, and we thought long and hard, well, living out in the country, you have to have a pickup truck. And so we thought long and hard about getting the new F-150 Lightning. It's like, well, a lot of our day trips are to Sioux Falls or Mitchell or Pierre or the Twin Cities. Can we drive a pickup truck from Aberdeen to the hockey arena, watch our kid play hockey, charge fast enough to make it all the way home? And we can't, not right now. So, the infrastructure capability is going to be, I think, a challenge to increase those visitors, day trips, those kinds of things, to help build your economy and keep you guys running here. And I think that's an attractive thing to build that infrastructure. Green infrastructure, just greening up the environment, makes it more pleasant to live in, also makes it cooler, and will cool down those temperatures. I wouldn't say that Sioux Falls is maybe big enough for an urban heat island, but certainly keeping the urban environment a little bit cooler is maybe to your benefit, and reducing the runoff risk or flash flood risk as well when you have that kind of landscaping infrastructure in place. Improves air quality, so many benefits to this. So a couple of things I wanted to share with you regarding climate assessments or climate reports. So just about a little over a year and a half ago, there was an international climate report that came out in 2021, and that fed into some of what our national climate report will say. But this is an international report that's probably pretty well known by now. And this is where a lot of that climate model data gets pulled into that process. What I want to say here, though, too, is that our 5th National Climate Assessment actually has a draft out for public review. They just sent that out in November, and it's open until January 27th. So if you're interested in commenting on that report is very lengthy, I'll warn you. It has 32 chapters in it, and then appendices. There's quite a bit of information in there. But they do a really great job, and they follow the model that they've done for a while now, where they separate by regions of the country. So we're in the Northern Great Plains under that framework. And then they also separate by sectors. So they have water, energy, urban environment, transportation, rural environment, agriculture, tribal communities, all kinds of things. And then they talk about intersections of multiple sectors and other complicated systems. So I would encourage you guys to look at that. This is a picture of the 4th assessment that I have up there. But you do need to go on their website to do that. From what I understand, they get thousands of comments. And I know they have a crew, their whole staff looks at every single comment. They don't leave anything to chance or anything unaddressed in that process. So I know they spend a lot of time doing that. Also thinking of beliefs on climate change. There's been a series of surveys done by a lot of folks, but one of the longest running ones is from the Yale program on climate change and their survey. And what I want to tell you is if you agree that climate change is occurring, you're not alone. And that generally in the American public, about 75% of Americans agree that they say global warming. They use the words global warming, that agree that global warming is happening. More than half are very sure that global warming is happening. What's also unique about what the Yale survey shows is they have kind of a scale of action. How concerned are people about climate change or global warming? And we see increases in trend, and we look at the trends over time. I don't have time to share all that, but they go from alarmed and concerned as the most concerned, and then go to doubtful or dismissive on the right. There's an increasing portion of the U.S. public, the American public, that are falling into the alarm concerned category there. And as of a year ago, you see about 58% or so over half. That's where that over half comes from. And that's more like their willingness to take action. Here, locally in the Big Sioux River watershed, we did a climate survey of corn farmers about 10 years ago in 2012. And we compared, and we actually did it across the whole Corn Belt. So there are almost 5,000 farmers that replied to the survey that we did. At that time, I forget how many in the Big Sioux River watershed, but 4,800 across the Corn Belt. And we asked a lot of different questions about farming practices and those kinds of things, their ability to address weather extremes, those kinds of things. And so through this survey, we asked this explicit question: there's increasing discussion about climate change and its potential impacts. Please select the statement that best reflects your beliefs about climate change. When you look at the first two categories, A or B, those would say agree that climate change is occurring. And the C is climate change is occurring more or less equally by natural and human activities. So we kind of separated human and natural activities. But overall, looking at the A, B, and C categories, about 2/3 of farmers at that time, a decade ago, would already agree that climate change is occurring due to either human or natural causes. So you're not the only ones here, and that's very similar in line with what the Corn Belt farmers in general agreed with. Iowa State has continued this survey, and they have found that their numbers have even increased more in their farmer population as far as agreeing on climate change is occurring. Just in my last couple of minutes here, I wanted to share a thing that we have here at SDSU, monitoring climate, weather, and climate. And this is our Mesonet network of weather stations. And this is measuring weather every 5 minutes, but we do have some stations that have been out there for over 30 years. So that's climate quality, and that's our intention, or their intention, is to continue the Mesonet running for decades. Currently, they're in an expansion program funded by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and not surprisingly, they want to know more about what's happening with precipitation and soils in better predicting floods. And so with this program, they're building out to over 150 weather stations across the state. I believe the plan is about 4 years or so. So if you know someone who is interested in hosting a weather station, has maybe about an acre of land, who's willing to donate to that cause, or have them use that, they have the money for the equipment and the people and all the calibration and everything else for the data delivery online. This is a list of all the measurements that they're taking. And this is a picture of the station at the outdoor campus in Sioux Falls that they had a big ribbon cutting in August. You see a couple of VIPs there in the picture, most notably the engineer from Sioux Falls, right? They have excellent information coming out of there. So if you want to keep track of weather or climate over time, I encourage you to try using the Mesonet and see if there's something that we can build, a tool or data visualization that maybe will help you consider weather and climate a little bit more. I'll skip over some of that. I wanted to leave a couple minutes for questions if we have time. So thank you for listening, and thank you again, Holly, and the committee for the invitation to be with you today.